Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this call. Tonight, we will be discussing Philosophy, Who Needs It? By Ayn Rand. It's an essay that, in my opinion, captures pretty much everything to do with philosophy, and it's the best-selling the best-selling points of philosophy. If anyone was interested in studying philosophy, this is the essay to suggest to them to read. And we have two great guests to discuss this essay with tonight. Our first guest is James Valliant, who is the author of Creating Christ, How Roman Emperors Invented Christianity. And the other guest we have today is Don Watkins. Don Watkins is an objectivist and a fellow, and was a fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. He's co-authored a few books together with Yaron Brook, Free Market Revolution, How Ayn Rand's Ideas Can End Big Government, Equal is Unfair, America's Misguided Fight Against Income Inequality, and my personal favorite, In Pursuit of Wealth, The Moral Case for Finance. Thank you both for being here and discussing this essay with us. So I have read this essay many times, and I find the analogy with the metaphor with spaceman actually quite appealing, because I think it resembles pretty much the human condition when a man is first born. You see things around you and you don't know anything, and you cannot really make any decisions for yourself until you understand where you are and what's going on. So as the essay starts, she kind of sets out the main questions that philosophy deals with. And these are: where am I? How can I discover it? And what should I do? James or Don, why is it in that order, do you think? Why do you think, for example, metaphysics, as in where am I, comes first before ethics and epistemology? Couldn't the questions be, what should I do first? And how can I discover what should I do? And maybe how can I discover where I am? And why should I even try to discover where I am?
Well, the first answer is very simple. Let's look at it this way. To make anything, to do anything, to make a cup of coffee, as I did this morning, requires philosophy. Philosophy is inescapable, it is ubiquitous, it is unavoidable in any question, in any subject, and it starts with metaphysics.
Yeah.
That cup of coffee. Now, is this coffee that I'm pursuing coffee? Should I pursue coffee if I'm pursuing coffee? Can I pursue tea, or can I pursue chocolate or something? No. If I want coffee, I have to pursue coffee. And no amount of wishing, hoping, praying will turn coffee into coffee. I can't expect a Jesus to come along, turns water into wine, to turn my water into coffee. So the beginning is metaphysics, right? That coffee is coffee, A is A. If I want coffee, if I want a cup of coffee, I've got to identify coffee. It comes first, even before the methodology. To know what coffee is and to know how to make coffee, I'm going to need the sciences of botany, chemistry, all kinds of other things. But underneath all that, I'm going to need a methodology, an epistemology. How will I know? Underlying every science and every approach to any sub-question of knowledge is the method, how I know. But first, I've got to know that there's a subject matter and that subject matter is knowable. Metaphysics must come first. Epistemology is equally, the two are completely intimately tied. You really can't separate them out. But the question is A is A, is coffee coffee, and will my wishes and hopes turn something that isn't coffee into coffee? Answer, no. And it may seem like a bizarre question, is coffee coffee, to our modern, especially to our objectivist mind, but for most of human history, people lived in this miraculous worldview, this primacy of consciousness worldview, where they really did believe that God's wishes, or even my abracadabra wishes, could somehow control reality. So a primacy of consciousness view is actually what dominates human history. So the question of metaphysics, it underlies all of that. Does it make epistemology even possible? What is epistemology? Is it valid that I'm even learning what coffee is? And those questions must depend upon, is A is A? Is coffee coffee? It may seem uncontroversial to us with our scientific worldview, or especially our objectivist worldview, but for most of human history, the primacy, we had to overcome the primacy of consciousness to get a scientific worldview. So metaphysics must come first, and in the history of human knowledge, it came first.
Okay. Don?
So I think one thing that's very interesting is why she put this story in space to begin with, right? And the whole idea that she's trying to capture comes later when she says that these three questions about where am I, how do I know it, and what should I do are questions that when we go about our lives, we think we know the answers to. And what she's trying to do with the story is get us into a context where those seem like they're live questions and open questions that we have to actively seek answers to. And part of her whole perspective about philosophy is that we're making assumptions, we're assuming certain answers to these questions, and we're actually not aware of it. What philosophy is doing is two things. It's drawing our attention to these assumptions, and then it's helping us think about them self-critically. And if you think about, for instance, Socrates, like what was his big breakthrough is that he made assumptions that people were making about crucial concepts in human life, like what is justice and what is piety, what is truth. He made them explicit, and people found that when they tried to articulate answers, it was really hard, particularly when somebody said, well, if your answer is X, doesn't that imply Y? And they go, well, that sounds crazy. So that we're making assumptions. We don't necessarily know that we're making them. And then when we try to articulate them, they can be really hard to justify. And so she's saying, like, this is what philosophy is all about, is you're making these assumptions. They shape your life in profound ways, as James was pointing out. And so you basically have two choices, which is you can think about them critically so that therefore you're making good assumptions and shaping your life in a positive direction, or you're essentially out of control. And what philosophy, the way I think about it, and I think part of what Ayn Rand is hinting at or saying in this essay, is it gives you the ultimate control over your mind and your life. It doesn't give you full control. It doesn't make you God, but it gives you the most control you can have, because you have self-critically thought about the fundamental shaping all of your knowledge, choices, and emotions.
Boy, I would really want to echo that. So the thing about philosophy, and the reason why it underlies everything, is that it's implicit in everything. But being implicit means that we are not self-conscious, right? We are making assumptions all the time. And the deepest assumptions that we make control all of our thoughts and actions, whether we know it or not. You know, the great line from Molière, we speak prose long before we know it. We're philosophers long before we know it. And when you consider in the history of thought, as Don points out, the great revolution that the Greeks did was to make self-conscious epistemology, was to make us aware of logic in a self-conscious way, so that we can now systematically pursue knowledge in a more confident and effective way. It's drawing out the implicit assumptions, as Don points out, assumptions that people take for granted precisely because of the universal applicability of philosophy to everything.
Yeah. So then in the story, the astronauts make two decisions. The astronaut makes two decisions. One is not to look how far they are from the Earth. And they feel quite good about it. It says, if you don't look, you won't have to know, and perhaps you shield yourself from the fact that you are too far to return, and that makes you experience a foggy, pleasant, somehow guilty hope. So that's one thing that the astronauts decide to do. The next thing is, their instruments are broken, or they may be damaged. The astronauts are not sure, so they choose not to look at them, not to check them, because if they are potentially broken, then what's the point in actually taking a look? What does that equate to in terms of philosophy?
We know to act. The reason is not only our means of knowing, our most basic means of knowing, it's also because of that our most basic means of survival. What do I do? And whether any question, even back to my making coffee, should I have that cup of coffee, right? What do I do with that? Is the pleasure of the coffee actually worth it given my health situation? Again, I'll need the science of nutrition. I'll need experience to whether I enjoy coffee. And certainly only philosophy can tell me, for example, bring out self-consciously that if life is the standard of values and should guide my choices, then I should only be drinking coffee insofar as it advances my life. And
the instruments.
Now, we have to know how our instruments function. We have to know whether or not our instruments are functioning well. That's the subject of epistemology, right?
Yeah.
Knowing how our instruments function is the critical basis for getting knowledge, just as knowledge is the critical basis for having our, not only what we can do, but the confidence in doing it. And the wonderful example there of the astronauts is, if you're not sure of your instruments, if you're not sure of your knowledge, that is going to paralyze you in action. It's going to demotivate you. Maybe I just sit here. My instruments I don't know what's going on out there. I can't be certain. I don't know how they work and to what extent I do know what I can know. And without knowing those things, my action itself is paralyzed.
Yeah. So the instruments, could we say that they're a metaphor for their senses, for human senses, right?
Indeed, for the entire cognitive apparatus.
Yeah. Okay. So they decide that they better do nothing. Now, my question to Don is, can the answer to the question, what should I do, can the right answer to the question, what should I do, ever be do nothing, wait for something to turn up somehow? Are there situations where this is actually a valid decision?
Well, I mean, you can certainly invent a scenario where it's better not to act. You know, if your friend collapses and starts convulsing, it's like, yeah, maybe I should wait for somebody with medical knowledge to come by. But if I think what she's doing, just to build on what James is saying, is, I mean, remember her line. You might say, like, no astronaut would act like this, right? Like they would never act like this. But then she says, this is how most people live their lives here on Earth. And so what she's getting at is she's illustrating the way in which, precisely because philosophy is implicit, if you don't take control over your mind and your life by thinking about this issue, you'll be doing something that, if I put it in stark contrast of an astronaut on another planet, you would recognize is completely self-destructive. If you're not consciously trying to understand, all right, where am I? Can I trust my instruments? Can I get home? What about these beings coming over here and giving me advice? Should I follow them blindly, or do I need to really step back and question? That she's getting you to see that you're making certain assumptions that are leading you to disaster, but you don't see that they're leading you to disaster precisely because they're assumptions. And so I think even more relevant than the kind of specific things that the astronaut's doing, looking at his instruments or whatnot, is this idea of when you're not fully conscious of philosophic issues, you act in ways that if you were fully conscious, you would think, that's crazy. That's obviously self-destructive. If you think about just the whole nature of evasion, if you put it in conscious terms, there's a fact I don't like, so I'm not going to look at it. That sounds like, well, that's probably not a very good idea, but yet people do it all the time. And one of the ways in which they make themselves okay with it is precisely through the sorts of philosophic rationalizations that they're provided with, which is, like variants of the primacy of consciousness. So it's not just that they'll turn a blind eye, they'll seem to take an action. I'm going to pray to God. I'm not actually going to look at the facts and try to navigate around them. I'm just going to pray or something like that. It's ways in which people do things that made explicit are crazy and yet can be made to seem not crazy through bad philosophy. And so that's kind of we're getting here the stakes involved of why you really need to take philosophy seriously. And that, she thinks, is very important to establish, precisely because people view philosophy as not having very big stakes.
Boy, that is exactly correct. Look at human history. There are evil people who really do evil things. But in human history, to get masses of people to do really horrific things, they usually have to believe they're doing a virtuous thing, right? When medieval Christians, for example, burnt heretics at the stake, they were doing it out of Christian love. They were doing it out of Christian love. You think, well, what is this life? Was this little temporary life compared to my immortal soul? Our answers to philosophical questions will govern what we value, what we seek, what we want out of life, and will make us completely oblivious, can make us completely oblivious to life-destroying behavior, such as burning heretics at the stakes just for their beliefs, and yet thinking we're doing it out of good motives. You know, you're saving their soul. This is my view of metaphysics. This is my view of ethics that comes from it. It is philosophy that really governs history and an individual life at that level, whether we know it or not.
Okay, so I think that's the end of the kind of the story of the astronaut. I mean, we also touched upon the point where there is some aliens possibly approaching, and then the astronaut decides that, okay, I'm going to wait for them to tell me what to do. So rather than deciding for himself, and then she goes on to analyze that, and she says most men spend their days trying to evade the three questions: where am I, how do I know, and what leads to their guilt, idleness, lack of confidence. Do you agree that this is true? I was reading somewhere that actually religious people seem to be happier than atheists, like based on some studies. Is it true that by figuring out reality, by using your reason and your senses to integrate your observations and to understand the world around you and the actions that you need to take to pursue your happiness and your self-interest, does it actually necessarily lead to happiness? Or could it be that you could achieve happiness by not taking these actions, by not understanding the world around you?
Well, I would
greater happiness.
Yeah, I would interpret the data about religious people being happier in a sense in terms of philosophy and the importance of philosophy. Part of happiness is knowing what we're doing and that what we're doing is right. To have a philosophy is already to give someone a sense of security, purpose, values. They have a philosophy. It may be a primitive philosophy. It may be full of errors, right? In fact, if it's a bad philosophy, it will be full of errors, and it will lead them to confusions, and it will lead them to contradictions. It will lead them to anti-life behavior in this world if they take their religious views seriously. It can cause suffering, untold suffering. Nonetheless, having that philosophy, having a sense of where we are, what we should do, is a component itself of happiness. It gives us confidence in our actions. It brings to bear at least what principles we have into action. And so much of secular thought has been an attack on knowledge. Imagine if you accepted some contemporary secular view of philosophy about the ethical relativism, right? Or a pragmatic theory of truth, right? That would undermine all of your knowledge and all of your values and make you confused and unhappy right there. So much of secular philosophy, since it doesn't give you a grounding in right? In where we are, how we know, what we should do. They've left us adrift. Modern philosophy is, in effect, disqualified themselves from ever being happy, ever being confident in what they do, because in effect, they've undermined those questions. They have an answer to those questions. Those answers prevent them from getting knowledge, prevent them from knowing how they should act, and therefore are necessarily frustrating. In a sense, more frustrating than having a mistaken philosophy, right? Because you have the confidence, at least, of some knowledge and some moral principles, even if you're mistaken. Now, obviously, that's going to be contradictory. The only way you can really successfully act is with a philosophy that's consistent with reality.
Don?
I mean, it's kind of a funny question, right? Like, it's really what it's asking is, would you feel more confident if you knew what the hell you were doing? Right? Like, like go back to your friend falls down in front of you in convulsions. It's like, would you feel more confident in this situation if you understood medicine? Well, yeah, obviously I would be more confident if I was empowered to deal with reality better. And so that's basically her point, or part of her point, is that what philosophy gives you is a greater sense of control over your life and of the world, including the knowledge of the limits of your control, which is, she's a whole essay in the book Philosophy Who Needs It about the way in which philosophy helps us distinguish between those things I can't control, so I just have to accept. I don't have to feel anxious about them or kind of like pound my fists against the dirt. I just need to accept them with serenity. And then I need to, within the realm of that which I can change, exercise all of my knowledge and effort in order to do it. And philosophy, by helping you understand what you can control and then giving you powerful tools to control it, that's very much at the root of gaining confidence.
Yeah, I totally agree. I remember when I was a student in college and I did my first philosophy class, and the teacher was, well, I think he was a skeptic. He really advocated Hume. So I ended up also being seduced by Hume's ideas. And it was probably my most depressed state I've ever been in, because I just started questioning, well, is anything around me real? Is it all an illusion? How do I know? So certainly it makes you less confident to follow such philosophies, less confident and unhappier than you would have been if at least you believed in an imaginary person in the sky giving you some sort of certainty. Now, then she goes on about philosophy compared to other sciences. And she says that philosophy differs in the way it answers these questions. But how could you make it clearer for the people listening to us? For example, couldn't you have a particular science to answer where I am? Say it could be geography, or you could find out, how do I know something? Well, you could use learning psychology for that, or what should I do? There's many sciences that can give you answers to these questions depending on what the problem is. So if you have financial problems, it could be economics. If you have I don't know, if you're trying to make some sort of chemical, you would use chemistry. If you're trying to build something, a machine, you would use engineering. So how does philosophy differ from the other sciences?
Well, the question is, what do those sciences consist of? And what those sciences consist of is specialized study of a certain field of knowledge, a certain aspect of reality. But in order to study an aspect of reality, you come in with certain assumptions. You come in with, and the question is, which assumptions are the right ones to import at the beginning of what you're studying? Like, do we live in a world where you can even trust your senses? Because if you can't trust your senses, then you can't, your physics experiment is worth exactly zero. If cause and effect doesn't exist, then what does it even mean to study a field? What are you trying to identify if there is no relationship of cause and effect in the universe that can be relied upon. So there's assumptions that are built into all these sciences. And then if you get into any science of action, you need, what goal are we trying to achieve in the first place here in order that we can study how best to achieve it? So the point is not that kind of philosophy is separate from these or that it's more important, but that it is fundamental, which means it's shaping all of sciences at the foundation. And so you want the best foundations. But if philosophy, precisely because it's fundamental, it is not all, it doesn't tell you everything you want to know about life. On the contrary, it's crucial that you have specialized knowledge that can't be known through philosophic means, that can't be known through introspection and reflection on kind of basic facts about history and about the world that everyone has access to. So she's not intending to demean the special sciences. On the contrary, she's saying we need the special sciences, but in order for them to function effectively, in order for them to give us what we need in order to live, we need a good foundation for them. And I think the kind of state of the sciences today testifies to that.
Yeah. Philosophy is inescapable for everyone. That is to say, it is the underlying method that all the sciences use that's being analyzed. It's the underlying metaphysical premises that all the sciences assume, because that scientific method itself is based on those. So whether it's botany, to take the driest science you can possibly find, I don't know, chemistry or something that you think is really, really just the driest thing, cannot escape either the how we know question or the so what question. Why are you studying chemistry? What's the point? What is the purpose of your investigation? What knowledge will that yield, and why is that important? Right? It cannot direct our not. Without values, we can't even direct the investigation. Every subject, whether it's law, medicine, history, physics, chemistry, all of them cannot avoid basic methodological and evaluative questions. They all involve, any question of human knowledge, any question of human action involves philosophy. It is inescapable. Don points out, we live in a division of labor economy. It's very easy to think, well, like I trust my car mechanic, why can't I trust philosophers? Not the same. We all have to be philosophers. We don't all have to be at least to some extent. We don't have to be professional philosophers, but to some extent, we need an answer. All of us need answers to basic methodological and evaluative questions, or we cannot function within that specialized science. All other fields require philosophy in a way that, say, car mechanics doesn't rely on, chemistry or something. To some extent, it may. All knowledge is integrated, but the point is, it's not a divide. You can't slice it up like you can botany or history or chemistry. Philosophy is a part of every question.
Yeah, thanks. Then she goes on to metaphysics, I think, to define kind of the different schools of metaphysics. So on one side, she has a universe that is based on natural laws that are stable, firm, absolute, and knowable, and that there's real things around us which are based, which are there independent of observation, and they require action in order to change them. And on the other side, she has the universe as being an incomprehensible chaos, full of inexplicable miracles, unpredictable, unknowable flux that the mind can't grasp, and that it's a universe that basically the things around us are created by the observer, and they're changed through an act of consciousness, like a dream, a wish, or a belief. Now, is there, even though I understand that there's a lot of philosophers out there that may advocate the second definition of universe, the second view of metaphysics, is it really possible for anyone to survive, even for 1 second, holding these beliefs as true?
Well, first of all, you have to get, I don't think that what she's doing is kind of giving like, this is the only two views, or that, you know, people are selecting between A and B. What she's illustrating is to give you a sense of what is the subject about. And then there's a range of different views that one could hold on it. And so she's giving kind of two stark alternatives. And so, yeah, I mean, if a person literally held the most primacy of consciousness view and tried to live by it, that would be really problematic for them. But I think what she's trying to set out is the scope of the subject, and then presenting kind of this is the kinds of answers that philosophy is going to give you that you have to choose between. And of course, you know, many philosophers wouldn't take either of those views, at least not in exactly those terms.
Exactly. But the consequences are real nonetheless. Implicitly, we have to act on a primacy of consciousness, you know, law of identity basis. If I was to try and pretend that poison was nutritious food, you know, literally at that level, I would die immediately. So in terms of most of even the people who deny, say, you know, correct metaphysics, they are, whether they know it or not, implicitly, a lot of the time, acting on a primacy of consciousness premise. Now, knowing that self-consciously avoids errors and allows me to be consistent, right? More than that, the consequences of a belief like that are you can't stop the consequences epistemologically, psychologically, in your behavior. You know, I was talking to a very religious person the other day, and they really believe in exorcisms and ghosts. You imagine the world of terror you'd live in if you really believed that those things were correct. The lack of confidence you'd have, how that would shape your behavior. All of these beliefs are going to have a consequence down the line, necessarily, unavoidably.
Yeah, but even going back to David Hume, for example, even imagine, it's hard for me to imagine how David Hume went on to live his life if he had to question every single time, for example, whether he's going to get burned if he puts his hand in the fire, because he's not sure. It only happened, let's say, the previous time, but this time it may be different because natural laws are not stable, or you cannot be certain of anything. So I certainly find it quite surprising that these metaphysical ideas are so popular.
Well, I mean, remember
Now,
what Hume. Well, I mean, you know, Hume was open that part of his whole point was, this is dogma. The whole philosophic game is a game. It's what he's trying to show is not live your life this way, but look, guys, this is ridiculous. You can't reach any sensible answers here. So we need to set philosophy aside and then go about living our lives. And how do we live? Well, I mean, you basically have some kind of version of common sense that, you know, I mean, the modern variant of it, I think, would be pragmatism, where it's what you set aside is you set aside principles, and then you just kind of do what works, which is the kind of cashing out of this view of, hey, principles lead us to these hopeless quandaries and don't give us any usable guidance. And so one way that you can think of is, to an extent that a person buys into a completely crazy theory or thinks that philosophically that's what's justifiable, to the extent they substitute something, it's going to be some form of going by the seat of your pants. It's, well, look, this is what I think is true in theory. In practice, you can't actually function by that. So you have to go by the seat of your pants. And so what they get is exactly the kind of thing Jim's talking about, which is that they are acting without any framework, any consistent framework, and it's scattershot. And what happens is they're usually not irrational in cases where something's close to the perceptual level. Like, they don't stick their hand into the fire, right? But the more that the threat is not perceptually obvious, the more that it's voting for a policy that in 15 years is going to wreck the economy, the more that it's going to a church that, yeah, today you were surrounded by friends and family and they're patting you on the back, but it's going to rob you of the confidence that, if let's say you build a successful company, that you should feel proud of that, or that you face a choice about, I'm unhappy in my marriage. Should I get a divorce? No, I'm supposed to just suffer for eternity in this marriage so that I don't suffer for eternity literally after death. It's the less that it's perceptual levels where you see the destructiveness of these ideas.
Well, exactly. And if you look at someone like Hume, in effect his policy is to keep the philosophically implicit in the way his approach, right? Since it is just a game, we go by our feelings. Ethics boils down to feelings for him, right? And so the reason why he wouldn't put his hand in the fire is because he knows that it hurt. So all we have to do is go by our pleasure pain mechanism and our emotional mechanism, because that's all values amount to for him. Now look at what he's blinded himself to. He is on purpose cut off any understanding that emotions are the result of our thinking, of our value judgments, and that those value judgments in themselves are either correctly aligned with the needs of our life or they're not, right? And so he said that the whole objective process of trying to find knowledge is just a game, as Don said. The whole process of ethics is really just doing what you feel like doing, right? And so as a matter of policy, he's saying, keep all that implicit stuff implicit. Don't try and find the objective basis of your values. Don't try to understand the relationship between your values and your emotions. Keep all that fuzzy and mysterious, because that's the human condition.
Sounds like he wasn't advocating for philosophy, even though he was a philosopher.
In fact, he's doing the exact opposite that Ayn Rand is doing in philosophy. Who needs it, right? Philosophy, who needs it?
Yeah, exactly. That's it. So then she goes on to the field of epistemology, and again she shows the alternatives on where knowledge may derive from. So she says, does knowledge derive from reason, which is the process of identification and integration of the data that we receive from our senses, or does it come from a sudden revelation from a supernatural power, or is it fed to us by innate ideas that we have pre-birth? And I think on that point, I know amongst the people that are watching us, probably the sudden revelation is not something that we need to debate much. But how about the innate ideas? How about ideas? How about instincts, or things that we are born to have an inclination towards, or kind of maybe desires that we cannot explain, where even a child may have them, that surely they haven't thought things through and integrated and got through the process of reason at that point, but they still have kind of urges. They show kind of character traits before they are fully grown and before they had a chance to employ reason. Where do those fit into the epistemological view of objectivism?
Well, I'll make one high level point just about the role of those questions in relation to this essay. So, like, her point is, those are precisely the kinds of questions that should arise for a person if they're thinking about, like, how am I going to make decisions and how should I judge myself? Part of it you would have to know is, well, wait, like, can I count on my feelings? Aren't some of them reliable guides to knowledge? Maybe evolution. I mean, in modern terms, right? Like, evolutionary psychology would suggest that if we have a way of reacting to things, it's probably a good way, so I should just go with it. And so part of what she's saying is, yeah, there's a lot of plausible questions that should arise of what can I count on, and even if you just from a kind of common sense way go, yeah, I'm not just going to believe the preacher said that this 2,000-year-old book is filled with all the answers. I'm not just going to believe that. There's still a lot of questions. And so you can't just go by common sense, even if that can get you, pretty far in certain cases, because there are all these real questions about, like, well, what does it even mean to go by reason? And and how would you conceptualize something like instincts and how it applies to human beings? And how should we, figure out what we can count on? Should we look at how animals function and draw conclusions about how that applies to humans? So I think the questions you raise are good ones, and objectivism has a lot to say about it. But from the perspective of this essay, the major thing is, yeah, those are things that every human being has to be able to answer. And it's not obvious what the answer is. You can't just kind of like, once you hear the question, it pops in your head, oh, this is obviously the way to proceed.
If the ancient Greeks' self-conscious discovery of logic presented a milestone in human knowledge, right? We were learning, we were discovering with logic long before the Greeks self-consciously developed this science of logic, right? Ayn Rand her achievement is on the same scale, in my view, when it comes to understanding the necessity that consciousness itself has an identity, right? You can't just know in any old way, right? To know is to know by a specific means, in a specific form, and sometimes it's acquirable because we have the relevant information, sometimes it isn't, right? Ayn Rand's understanding that consciousness possesses an identity, right, points us to an inescapable part of the inescapability of philosophy. We cannot escape these methodological questions. The kind of questions that you're bringing up, right? We can't, for most of human history, we've been seating our pants with that. We really haven't known the significance of that. Knowing that taking self-conscious control of our consciousness is actually where it begins. And it's that awareness, of course, that'll make us better thinkers, right? Yeah. Across the board.
This question reminds me of my first job that I got in reviewing credit risk, and I went to my new boss, then the head of that department. I won't say which company, and he said to me, "Welcome to credit risk, George. It's not a science. Sometimes it's a gut feeling that you have when you are reviewing credit." Thankfully, I don't think I ever tested his theory by writing a credit risk review and said, well, I'm approving this credit on a gut feeling, because I think that would fail every methodology ever written on assessing credit risk. But Ayn Rand asks this question, says, is reason enough, or is there something else that is better out there? And is certainty possible? And I think that particular one, is certainty possible, is something that bothers a lot of people, because they will tell you, how can I be absolutely certain about anything? How was Hank Rearden, for example, certain about his metal before he actually created, before he tested it, when he was still kind of developing it? How does certainty, where does certainty come from in life?
Well, certainty in the widest sense comes from defining a standard of proof and meeting it. So that's and people's skepticism about certainty is almost always a result of defining certainty not by a standard of proof and meeting it, but by infallibility and omniscience. So it's like, in order for me to count on knowledge, I want to know in the way that a God would know, which is there's no possibility of being wrong. There's no possibility I misapplied the method. There's no possibility that what I learned tomorrow might cause me to adjust my formulation. And then since I can't have that, you just throw your hands up and say, all right, well, we can't be certain of anything. And part of what we get from Ayn Rand is that all of our concepts, if they're to be legitimate concepts, have to be, and if you think of certainty as a norm, as a goal that we're striving for, they have to be defined in a way that's actually attainable. And so from the human perspective, certainty is a way to identify the epistemological status of an idea that requires the accumulation of evidence over time. And then it's saying, well, once you've met the threshold of proof in that process, now you have you should regard that as certain, which means you can count on it, you can build on it, and you need to keep revisiting it and integrating it with future things you know. But that it's solid. It's something to be built upon, not something to throw your hands out and go, oh, well, maybe.
Right. We need a method, and we need to know that that method connects us to reality, consciousness as an identity. I know how my senses, I can know how my senses connected me to reality. The logic keeps my thoughts consistent, keeps me connected to reality. A crystal ball, tea leaves, and ESP, and all abracadabra, all those pseudo methods are really the implicit understanding that even primitive people knew they needed some kind of causal mechanism to connect them to reality, right? Some kind of causal mechanism. That's where all the various forms of mysticism really come from, right? But it has a specific identity, and you can't just get knowledge any old way. And that is a discovery in itself. And the self-conscious pursuit of knowledge in a disciplined self-conscious way is itself a discovery, a necessary discovery. Before we have that discovery, right, we don't know the importance, right? It's an implicit, again, going back to what Don said at the beginning, which is critical here. It's implicit. Philosophy is drawing out those ideas that are implicit in all of human knowledge, all of human action, the escapable. And those are themselves discoveries. Logic, the identity of consciousness. Absent that kind of knowledge, philosophical knowledge, we really can't be confident. We need to act. Sometimes we're not acting with perfect certainty or even reasonable certainty. But Don's also right there. Look, we're acting with reference to the idea that somehow divine omniscience or intrinsic revelation will somehow get us the real truth, right? The questions to these answers, the answers to these questions are absolutely crucial to everything we know, and therefore everything we do.
Okay. Then she moves on to ethics. And the two statements that I feel stand out from that paragraph is that ethics apply only to men, to humans, and that ethics defines a code of values to guide man's choices and actions. The choices and actions that determine the course of his life. Now, the two questions I have on this paragraph is why do ethics only apply to humans? For example, you could have a good guard dog or a bad guard dog, or you could have a good horse to plow the fields or a bad horse to plow the fields. Why is it only a domain for humans? And the second one is it possible to have a moral code that is valid in every context and for all humans, even though we have to acknowledge that there are differences between humans?
Well, the first question is basically the fact that we alone are conceptual. No other animal is. Their values are built in effect, to their very bodies, right? Their actual modes of behavior are built into their very bodies. They don't have free will because they aren't conceptual beings, right? And not being conceptual beings, they don't need a subject like philosophy to integrate and organize their knowledge. They simply don't have conceptual knowledge in the way they do, the way we do. They're not organizing abstractions and integrating abstractions the way we do. Philosophy is a necessity for humans because human consciousness works conceptually. That's really the basic answer there, isn't it?
Okay.
We need to ask the underlying, animals have to wait for physical evolution before their behavior changes, right? We don't. We have a creative mind. We can change our behavior because we make a discovery, an intellectual discovery, right? Understanding that aspect of our nature is absolutely critical. Philosophy is unique to humans because we have to question things at that level. We have to become self-conscious about our method of knowing, right? When it comes to values, right? Again, we go back to what Don was saying about implicit knowledge. Aristotle kind of assumed that everyone was pursuing their life and egoistic values, right? He never brought it out explicitly, the relationship between life and value. It was sort of implicit in what Aristotle was saying. Ayn Rand, serving in the 20th century the invaluable service of pointing out the relationship, the actual relationship between value pursued as such and life, is giving us the cognitive way to solve our ethical problems, right? In a self-conscious way, to avoid the confusions. Knowing that life is the standard, now I can assess my values. What's my hierarchy of values? What's really more important to me? Absent that self-conscious discovery, that philosophical discovery, I'm kind of adrift. Yeah, I can kind of, like Aristotle, have the sense if I want the best life, I should do X, Y, and Z. But to know explicitly that life is the standard clarifies that hierarchy and makes clear why it is what I'm doing. Those kind of questions, even before we know the answers, will have impact on the conclusions we draw in ethics, right? The confidence we have in acting on our ethical behavior, right?
Yeah.
You say to yourself, could some other standard apply? No. The concept of value is, you cannot understand the concept of value apart from the concept of life. It is both metaphysically and epistemologically dependent on the concept of life. So that's not optional. Now, do we have values? And are we aware of values long before we're aware of the relationship between life and values? Yeah, I want things. I pursue things. I pursue values. Again, it's what I'm implicitly doing. Now, before we understand that, we have all kinds of, the need to understand why it is those are our ethical values. And so we have religious philosophical systems, we have more contemporary utilitarianism, more secular philosophical systems, trying to understand why it is we have the values we do. Right? Until we understand, though, the answer to that philosophical question, the relationship between life and value, we will be hopeless in trying to understand ethics. These other ethical theories are wrong. They're going to create confusions, contradictions, a lack of clarity in our hierarchy of values. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Done.
Well, just to the point, you raised the question of, well, how do we know that, like, the guidance is universal to humans and can it differ? Well, there's a lot of guidance that does differ from individual to individual. But if you think of what morality is trying to do, it's trying to address the values and virtues that are true with us, not from the respect of, Don Watkins versus Jim Valliant, or firefighter versus teacher, or, Chinese versus US, but that which is true of us given our nature as human beings. And insofar as that nature is universal, then the guidance offered is going to be universal. And that's exactly what ethics is getting at, is what is true about how we should live, given that we're human beings. And then with objectivism, the particular guidance is all rooted in the fact that we share a common means of survival. That is, we survive by the use of reason, by the use of our mind. And therefore, that's going to apply to human beings precisely because that is a shared attribute of us. And indeed, as Ayn Rand points out, like, that's our distinctive attribute. It's what separates us from the other animals. And so it's in the very nature of what ethics is that the guidance is going to be universal. And that what it does is, you can think about the same way that philosophy and the special sciences, philosophy provides a certain foundation for the special sciences. For specific guidance, you can think about it as philosophy's providing the foundation. So for example, if I'm a teacher, there's a lot of guidance that's not going to be applicable, to me, that's not going to be applicable to somebody who's a firefighter or who's, running a tech company. But it's going to give me fundamental guidance about, well, what is, a proper goal to be pursuing. So it's even the question of what's the purpose of education, that's going to be informed by a universal set of ethics. So if your ethics says, for instance, that your job is to do your duty to the nation, well, then education is turning out good citizens and good, obedient followers. Whereas if your view of the good is the flourishing of the individual, then by the use of their mind, then education is going to be helping nurture the development of the individual's mind, including their ability to think and including their ability to value. And I think that's a helpful example because it's one where Leonard Peikoff, Ayn Rand's student, actually worked out kind of an overview of the objectivist approach to education. And I think I've even been on this show. A number of objectivists have literally gone and started transforming the field of education. I think there you can see what is the right intersection between philosophy and a specialized subject, both at the level of kind of, you could put it, science, but also the level of guidance.
Yeah, that's a positive example. Take a negative example of going wrong in philosophy. Here you've got Ayn Rand, implicitly Aristotle, and now explicitly Ayn Rand saying, no, life is the standard of values. Consider the clarity that that brings to one's hierarchy of values. Now consider, in contrast, say, Kant's deontological approach to ethics. There he severs, destroys at the very root any connection between life or indeed any consequences and values. He's arguing for a duty-based ethics, an ethics that may not have anything to do with life on earth at all, just a duty that you have to do regardless of consequences. That will necessarily destroy and undermine the actual, your values, ethics, the whole purpose of ethics. The necessity of ethics is being undermined from the outset with a Kantian set of ethics. You'll be acting sometimes in self-destructive ways because you're acting out of duty and not with respect to life, human life being the standard, your life being the purpose. When you've divorced yourself from that, of course, you've divorced yourself from objective ethics, the real nature of values themselves, right? And your behavior, all of your emotions and all of your behavior thereafter will be conditioned by that error, as opposed to, say, believing life is the standard of value. Now all your values will be oriented around your happiness, your life, with an understanding that this is what human life requires. Two totally different perspectives, right?
We have a question from Stephanie, and she asks, how did you achieve certainty that there is no God? What specific steps did you take to arrive to the conclusion that I am certain there is no God?
Well, I am particularly certain that there is no God, and for a number of reasons, right? Normally, the way God is defined is itself a contradiction. It's philosophy. Absent philosophy, there's no way to answer a question like that, right? You need the methodology to answer a question like that, right? You need the correct metaphysical premises to answer a question like that. If A is in fact A, if Ayn Rand is correct, and things possess identity, right? As God is traditionally defined, it is gibberish, it is nonsense. There's no infinite being. Infinity is impossible. There's no omnipotent being. That's impossible. There's no being that cannot operate except by the law of cause and effect. That's impossible. There's no creator to the universe. The universe is everything. There's nothing left over to be the cause. That's primacy of consciousness to begin with. So if you have the correct metaphysics, right, you know from the outset that the way God is traditionally defined is simply an impossibility. Now, more than that, I can understand the development of human consciousness, and I can understand why the primacy of consciousness would be the way humans would start. They couldn't distinguish their consciousness, their purpose, from the whole universe. It's got purpose and consciousness, and just as we have purpose and consciousness. And so science begins when we leave out divine explanations, primacy of consciousness explanations, and with natural causal explanations, right? We had to learn to overcome the primacy of consciousness. So knowing where the idea of God causally comes from in human history, that it's inevitable given the nature of our unique consciousness, right? I know where it comes from. Secondly, I have the correct metaphysics, the law of identity. I know that these kind of identityless or identity contradicting things, such as a God, are simply impossible, right? That's before I even get to epistemology and the burden of proof and all of that.
Don?
Well, I'll just say a couple of things. I think about it a little bit differently. I mean, I don't disagree with any of the major points that you made, Jim, but so I think it's fine to say, like, I'm certain there is no God, but I think the objectivist position is that's not really the kind of claim that we need the concept certainty for. That's just kind of underlying, like, yeah, I don't have any doubts. Whereas certainty, you're much more dealing with situations where you're accumulating evidence over time. And that does not apply, I think, to an issue like the existence of God. It's more like the issue of, the law of gravity, and those how to judge a criminal trial. Is this person guilty or not? Those are the cases where you're defining a standard of proof and then looking at the evidence and seeing, or does the evidence actually meet the standard of proof? Whereas I think religion, though there are cases, as Jim points out, where the more that they try to give identity to the claim, the more that you can just dismiss it for philosophic reasons. I think it primarily falls into the category of the arbitrary. And so the way I think about it is essentially what atheism really is not that I've gone through an evidence of accumulating proof and reach the conclusion that God doesn't exist, but it's that there's no real evidence offered for any kind of coherent proposition. And therefore, it stands in my mind the same way it would to somebody who's never even heard the idea that God exists. It plays no role in my mind. It's not that I walk around going, yeah, I'm really going to implement in my life that God doesn't exist. It's that there is no idea there to integrate, to apply, to assess. It's only culturally that you need the concept so that you can govern your way through the fact that there's a lot of people who think God does exist.
Well, I think that's the case here in the 21st century. I think we have to cut a whole different set of slack for people thousands of years ago. They haven't yet discovered the primacy of existence in an explicit self-conscious way. And they are simply assuming that everything is like themselves with consciousness and purpose. So there is a self-conscious discovery there that happens. And it's a philosophical discovery, isn't it? It's one that's really basic and fundamental about the nature of the universe. To them, it was almost the integrated sum of their knowledge, right? There are divine forces like me working around. That was a mistake. It was an irrational mistake, an unjustifiable mistake. But nonetheless, it was a mistake in integrating what they thought they knew about the world. At some point, that surely ended. And it was more than a mistake. It was an evasion of everything else that they knew. At that point, I'm with Don completely. It shouldn't even come up. It's a totally arbitrary idea at that point, right? He's correct. Certainty in most cases, and even as that one began, I would argue, but certainty in most other cases is really a question of, does the accumulated evidence have the power? Have I got enough of the relevant? Have I integrated properly all the evidence so that I have reached reasonable certainty? And that requires a careful assessment, usually of an entire body of evidence, right? So he's right about that. In our current context, real issues of certainty are like that, right? Not ancient ones that we should have long ago gotten past.
Thanks, James. We also have a question from Ed, which I think is relevant to what we just discussed. His question is, there are a lot of things that are uncertain. So how should an objectivist deal with uncertainty? Should we accept it? Yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No.
I think this is a really interesting question, and I'll kind of name the, I think, conventional objectivist view, but then I want to add something to it. So the kind of main formulation that you get in objectivism is that in cases of uncertainty, like, don't act on that knowledge unless you have to, and then you just go with, whatever the most probable is in cases where you have to act and you can't avoid it. I actually think there's a lot more thinking and work that can be done to develop in this area, because I think there's a whole issue of kinds of errors you can make, right? So let's say it's I'm pretty certain that something is true, but if I act on it and I'm wrong, I get catastrophic consequences. Whereas if I take a different action, even though I think it's less likely to be true, the downside might be a lot less. I think there's more work to be done with how do you govern uncertainty. I think it's a really important question. I think it's something that objectivists haven't grappled with as much as I would like to see going forward.
Oh, I agree with that totally. Most of our knowledge is not, there is certain knowledge. Certainty is possible, but it's an achievement and it takes quite a bit of effort and you have to have the right context. And apart from certain basic metaphysical premises, sometimes the information is just simply not available as it is for all of, that's what's cool about metaphysics, right? We all have all of the information that we need to come to conclusions, certain conclusions, at least about metaphysics. This is not true about the specialized sciences, and it's certainly not true about a lot of the acting that we need to do in the real world. We're acting on a degree of certainty or degree of probability. And there again, Don makes a great point. How important is this? What is the consequence of my error? And there, the degree of probability or the degree of certainty would matter. But so much of knowledge is, I think this is reasonably probable versus I think this is reasonably certain. And there is a whole science there to be developed.
Well,
it's a matter of knowing what our values are too. You can't do this in a disintegrated way. It's both epistemological and evaluative, right?
And one thought that just occurred to me. Ayn Rand actually was aware of this dynamic in the sense that, so if you think about her position in the death penalty, her view is morally it's right, but that even if you're highly certain that, or not highly certain, even if you think it's highly probable somebody's guilty, even to the point where you would convict them, that you were certain beyond a reasonable doubt, to use that, her view is, well, like the downside of being wrong is you can't fix that mistake, and therefore the government shouldn't have that power. So she was aware that it's not just that you just go by, all right, well, I'll go with the most probable item of knowledge. You have to take into account some of the factors Jim was mentioning, including like, what are the stakes of being wrong, and can I fix this if I am wrong? But I think it's such a great question and something that does deserve a lot of thinking.
Agreed.
Okay. Stephanie asked also another question. She asked if the method that we just discussed about religion, if the same method can be used to address environmentalism, and like we used to refute the existence of God.
Insofar as environmentalism is a religion, yes. Insofar as they're based on, obviously, fallacious metaphysical premises that we can know. Very similarly, yes, right? If your environmentalism is, and this is not real environmentalism, but if you're one of these, superficial, ordinary Americans who just wants, no litter in the park, okay, that's not what I mean by environmentalism. If by environmentalism you really mean man is the enemy here, nature, man's the problem, man's the virus, then no. That is obviously a religious idea. It's anti-life on Earth, right? It's anti-reason, right? It's primacy of consciousness, right? Think of all the religious ideas in environmentalism. They have Garden of Eden fallacies, the fall of man from grace fallacies, some future nirvana fallacies. If you think about it, environmentalism is religion and can be, real environmentalism can be refuted like you would refute a religion on philosophical grounds. All you need is some basic metaphysics, correct epistemology, and a correct approach to ethics, and you can see that environmentalism is anti-life, anti-man, and must have destructive consequences.
I think this is a good point to go back to the essay, because next, what comes next is again metaphysics, but on the nature of man. And the two alternatives described there are, one alternative is that man is rational, capable to deal with reality, and is capable to pursue achievement and enjoyment, to achieve enjoyment in life. The other alternative is man is helplessly blind, a misfit, is doomed to failure, disaster, and suffering. And when I read this, especially the suffering, it reminded me of our friend Jordan Peterson, who claims that life is about suffering. Now, even though when she explains it in this essay, I think the choice between the two is fairly easy. How would you explain that the school of thought that has life, describes life as a process of suffering and describes humans as completely incapable of dealing with their problems? How do you think that this school of thought has gained so much popularity? What is it that drives this popularity?
Well, look, I mean, it's not like you have to search hard for evidence that there can be a lot of suffering in life. And before the Industrial Revolution, it would be very hard to reach any kind of different conclusion. Like if you're living in medieval Europe, and to have a view that life isn't suffering, you would have to be. It's hard to even imagine how one could come to hold a view like that. But part of Ayn Rand's, one of her statements that has been kind of passed down is that she didn't think she could have, or she knew she could not have developed her moral outlook on life, her moral theory, prior to the Industrial Revolution. And so part of what you saw during the Industrial Revolution was the incredible power to transform life for the better that reason gave us, right? And so what reason did was show that actually we were not like animals, kind of passive pawns in the face of a hostile universe, but that we could master the universe, that we could master nature for the improvement of human beings with the power of reason. And so to me, that there is a real failing not to appreciate that discovery of the Industrial Revolution, but it's not a mystery why anybody could hold a kind of view that life is suffering. And certainly particularly if it's somebody like Peterson, who's really taking over a religious outlook, which of course was developed again when life really was suffering. But part of what gives it plausibility is that he packages together two very different kinds of things, which is the kind of, you could think of it as like the mess that people can make with their lives, or the mess that, or the kind of effects of malevolence, as he might put it, that gets packaged with just facts about life that, by Ayn Rand's view, are metaphysically given facts that one needs to accept with serenity. But if you take an attitude that, for example, we get sick, we die, and I'm going to rail against reality for being so unfair. My standard for judging reality is not reality as it is, but as I wish it were. Well, then, what an awful world that we live in, and how much, it's unfair that we die. It's unfair that we see our friends die. And therefore I'm going to blame all of existence and say that, it's stacked against man. I think what's going there is precisely the effects of a bad philosophy. A proper metaphysics would teach you, no, the standard by which I judge things is not my wishes, but reality as it is. And so the idea of condemning reality for being as it is would strike you as, I must have gone really terribly wrong in my thinking in some way.
What's really interesting for me about Jordan Peterson is that when pressed on questions like religion and Christianity, he won't give an epistemological or historical or philosophical defense of God or Christianity. He'll give a purely psychological one that comes through the idea that life is suffering. Why we need religious ideas, in effect, he's arguing, is because life is suffering. So instead of the metaphysics of mysticism informing his view that life is suffering, it's his view that life is suffering that's sort of informing his sympathy for religion, which I find rather paradoxical in itself. But you see how philosophy can work both ways this way, right? Usually it's our metaphysical, and they will always have a consequence because they're at the bottom of things. Our metaphysics that are going to have implications and inform us down the road. But look at Jordan Peterson. Here you have a psychological or ethical conclusion he's reached about the human condition. Life is suffering. And this is why we need religious thought. This is why religious concepts are valuable. Yeah, philosophy shapes someone like Jordan Peterson too. I mean, you think about it, whatever value Jordan Peterson is offering people, in a psychotherapeutic sense, right? He's undermining, in effect, by this entire approach. And this entire approach is grounded in philosophy, much more than in his psychology.
Thanks. Next in the essay come politics. So the way politics are positioned is that they derive from ethics. So my question here is, how are politics different from ethics? Are politics just the legal codification of morality, or are there some nuances to this? So, for example, it is immoral for me to get drunk every night because I will soon die from liver failure. Does this mean that the political implication of this kind of understanding that I have, does it justify the government to enforce an alcohol prohibition era, or is there a difference? And how do we identify the differences between ethics, what belongs to the moral sphere and what belongs to the political sphere?
Defer to Don.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so if you think about what politics is, it's the moral principles governing the organization of society. So we're trying to organize a society, and we need to be able to do it with principles. And certainly, and if you think about what it means to organize society by certain principles, it's the basic idea of we're trying to subordinate might to right. It's the idea that instead of everybody just using their fists and guns, we want to be governed by what was right. And historically, the most natural way to think about that is exactly what you're talking about, where people think, okay, well, morality tells us what's right, and therefore we'll just impose that on everybody by might. And it was a real achievement of the Enlightenment to see that actually there was a different way to think about it, that it was what morality is going to give us is what we're trying to protect with political organization, not that what we're trying to enforce. And part of how they came to that conclusion was to recognize that you can't enforce it. You can't force the good. And if you read Locke, particularly his letter on toleration, and this is all echoed throughout the founders, there was a real recognition of you can't force the true and the good on people. So that if your idea was, well, this is what ethics says is good, so why don't we just force it on people in politics to achieve the good? They were recognizing that you can't do that. Even if you believe God exists, and that's true, you can't force somebody to believe it. And this is something Locke went into great depth about. Even if you thought that a certain religious doctrine was morally right, it, at least by Locke's reasoning, well, it wasn't good if it was practiced at the point of the gun. And so the idea was, no, what we have to do is organize society so that a person can achieve the true and the good, but it's self-defeating to try to force it on them. And I think Ayn Rand takes that basic outlook and refines it and expands it, and I think has a much richer, more solid foundation for that kind of perspective. But it was really the achievement of Enlightenment thinkers like Locke.
I would say that you can look at it this way. On a desert island, if you were all alone, you would need metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And I put ethics there in capital E. People think that alone, ethics is primarily social and we wouldn't need it alone. Ayn Rand stresses this point repeatedly. However, politics doesn't enter until you get someone else. Robinson Crusoe gets Friday on the island, right? Until the appearance of Friday, politics isn't even possible. But politics becomes a universal. It is part of philosophy because it is a human universal, because we do live in societies. We are creatures that interact in a social way. So politics is universally necessary because of the way we interact as human beings. Right? Aesthetics, just to complete the thought, is necessary because that's the way, right, a conceptual consciousness must work. We need to render perceptual our metaphysical values to experience them emotionally and to remain motivated and connected to them. The basic fields of philosophy, if you will, are universal. The first three, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, would be needed on a desert island. So with aesthetics, in effect, politics is universal when you introduce Friday to the Robinson Crusoe situation and they decide to interact.
Okay, now we're still probably halfway through the essay, so I'm not going to continue with my notes, but I'll go on a question from Jonathan, and I'm going to read it because it's quite long. He says, in this essay, Ayn Rand talks about us not having a choice to integrate our observations, experiences, knowledge into principles. And then later, she makes the comparison that the subconscious is like a computer. Does she mean the subconscious is actively drawing out implications about what we do and say? For example, I one time say that that was a good theory, but didn't work in practice, and my subconscious starts making calculations where else this may apply. Or is it rather something like the subconscious is part of passively reinforcing certain habits and associations? For example, my Microsoft Word crashes, and so I smash my mouse in anger, and now I reinforce this way of reacting to my emotions just a little bit more.
Well, I would say your subconscious isn't doing any thinking at all.
Yeah.
It does do a kind of integration in terms of, this is a field of not philosophy, but psychology. But there's a philosophical element here. Your subconscious is integrating, but only by means of association, and mostly by means of emotional association, right? That's why conscious thought, there's no substitute for conscious thought, right? Because our subconscious could be associating, I have a traumatic experience and it involved a copper pot. Therefore, my self-protective psychological mechanisms will kick in. Next time I see a copper pot, even if it's being just used to cook, I may have a negative flinch reaction because the copper pot was used to hurt me. That was a subconscious integration, a subconscious association of copper pots to being hurt, which may not be logically connected at all. That's why I have to bring out the emotional associations, and they're just associations, that my consciousness is, and my consciousness is constantly working. It's processing, it's associating, it's developing, it's playing in effect with ideas, but not by means of rational thought. That is why we have to bring out the subconscious to our conscious mind so that we can be certain that we're dealing with it at least in a rational way. The subconscious mind isn't the rational faculty. That's our conscious mind, right? At least potentially. The subconscious mind is, however, doing all kinds of work, emotionally associating our experiences with one another. And that work is going on under the surface, whether we know it or not. And it's registering our values, whether some experience is consistent with our values or not. That's going on all the time. And in effect, it's programmed. Our subconscious is programmed by the values that we either consciously accept or just implicitly accept emotionally. And that's how we program our consciousness. So there's really only two choices, Ayn Rand says, right? Either we know what we're doing consciously, or we're sort of a free-floating, caromed from one, buffeted from one, bumper to another by means of emotion and circumstance.
Are you sure? I mean, I read this, and it made me think a lot about what I think about this, because she does say that the subconscious computer integrates the ideas, and the subconscious is programmed by the conscious mind, as you just described it.
But
don't you think
is the subconscious integrating logically?
Right.
Is the subconscious integrating in a conceptually correct way?
Okay.
It could be merely, like I say, what it's doing is a lot of associating. And like I say, psychologically, you could have a negative experience with a copper pot and then have a flinch to a copper pot that's totally irrational, because your subconscious alone was doing the integrating as opposed to your rational conscious mind. Is it?
Yeah. So it's not that the conscious just controls the subconscious. So No.
In fact, our emotions are automatic physical reactions to the values that we've programmed into our consciousness, right? And those values can be either done consciously, as Ayn Rand says, through a process of conscious reason, or they can merely be the grab bag of associations, say, that our childhood and our life experience has given us.
Great.
That's our only choice, is to be consistent and rational about our thinking on these things, or to passively accept what others have thought, or to passively go by our emotions, that is implicit values that we haven't really brought to our conscious mind, or not. It can either be implicit, right, and emotional, socially dependent, or it can be conscious, self-conscious, rigorous, and rational. That's our only choice.
We only have 5 minutes left, so I don't know if you both have the essay in front of you, but one of my favorite parts is when she lists a number of different quotes, not of the philosophers, but like sayings, popular sayings that we have in our culture, and then she attributes them to certain philosophers, like not attributes them directly, but said that's where these ideas have come from. So out of all of those, because there's a number of them, I've noted them all down, but out of all of them, do you have any particular one that is your favorite and that you would like to discuss before we end this call? Don, maybe you can start first.
Well, I mean, I just like the whole conception, because part of the skepticism that she expects to get from people is that, from their perspective, I don't need anything to do with philosophy. And what she's trying to say, and as we've talked about, her whole argument is, well, you're in the grips of philosophy. And then here she's giving one, though not the most important, but a very clever, tangible illustration of the fact that you find yourself resorting to catchphrases that come from philosophers, and you don't know that. You don't know if these ideas are true. You don't know if your catchphrases are consistent. And so that's if you think about what the role of catchphrases is, it's when people are trying to give final justification for an idea or an action. And the question is, all right, are these good ones? You guys are relying on ideas and you don't know where the hell they came from. So maybe you better figure it out. And so in that sense, I think it's extremely eloquent. And part of what's eloquent is that you get that their catchphrases don't hang together, that they clash with one another. And that even the way that you'll try to weasel out of the catchphrases is by resorting to more catchphrases, is that you can't escape the need for final justification, but that should come from a reflective take on philosophy rather than a just groping for something I heard somebody say once that sounded pretty good.
Right. And that's the way most people really, the way philosophy is actually governing people's lives. They just have sort of disintegrated set of sort of principles, catchphrases, which sort of seat of the pants govern it. But as Don points out, oftentimes they're in contradiction to each other. They'll follow one principle one moment, which is really only a semi-principle, and another principle another moment. And unless they have an integrated philosophy, it's going to be a grab bag like that, right? Necessarily. Philosophy is sort of inescapable again, and integrated philosophy is sort of inescapable that way. Of all the wonderful quotes that she has there, what she's pointing out is that, these things don't come from nowhere. Right? There were philosophers that actually argued for these things, and that those ideas have entered our cultural mainstream, whether we know it or not. Consistency, I've argued this with people before. Consistency, as Ayn Rand quotes, right, is the hobgoblin of little minds. Well, the actual quote is a foolish consistency. And I've argued, no, anyone who pits consistency, that is to say logic, against knowing, right? Each one of those is such a powerful thing, because they actually do govern the way people control their lives. Consider public policy, right? They just don't know the source. They don't know that itself was a philosophical argument that someone made a century ago, right? So, right. No,
I think it's our time to end now. So I'll use a catchphrase for this. I'll say, all good things come to an end, and therefore we have to finish our call. Thank you to our guests, Don and James. Thank you very much for this evening. I would also like to thank Razi for making this possible, and all the people that attended for their questions, and also the members of the Ayn Rand Center who contributed financially to make this possible. So thank you all very much. Next Wednesday, we will be discussing the objectivist ethics, and I hope to see you all there. Have a good day, evening, wherever you are. Bye.
Bye-bye.